Thank you, Gabriel. Thanks to all the organisers and everyone who's given talks so far and is to do so. And you'll see that there are particular intersections with what I'm going to say, with what Hannah's just said, particularly Sheila and also Denisa Nestakova, who's speaking tomorrow. It's clear that Claude Lanzmann would have liked to interview Rabbi Michael Dov Weissmandl for his 1985 film Shoah. Weissmandl was a renowned Orthodox rabbi in the Slovakian town of Nitra before the war. In 1941, when Slovakia was a satellite of Nazi Germany, he and his colleague Gizzy Fleischmann became leaders of the underground working group in Bratislava with a plan to rescue the Jews of Slovakia and then in Europe as a whole through bribery. Weissmandl survived the war but died in 1957, over 20 years before Lanzmann's filming began. The evidence for Lanzmann's interest lies in the outtakes of Shoah, where there are interviews about rather than with Weissmandl, but are they testimony from him nonetheless? These outtakes are the 220 extra hours of footage that Lanzmann did not include in the finished film. They're all available to view on the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum website in their unedited state. These outtake interviews therefore stand on the boundary between testimony and art, as footage awaiting editing into the form of a separate release, as Lanzmann has done with some of the material, most recently The Four Sisters. Weissmandl was no longer alive, and the interviews about him are only in the outtakes. There's none of it in Shoah, so he's doubly displaced. But these two factors make this indirect testimony not an exception, but a fitting example of what Holocaust video testimony always does. As one critic puts it, viewers experience their remove from the disaster by watching video testimony, twice over here where the protagonist is missing. Lanzmann's Weissmandl material would have fitted with the strand of discarded interviews concerning rescue and resistance in the Holocaust years. This is a contrast to Shoah itself. As we know, during the process of editing the footage, it focused rather on the process of death, specifically that in the extermination camps. But many of the discarded interviews focus instead on rescue and resistance, as you can see, Abakovna and Hansi Brand, not as triumphal narratives, but as ways of addressing Lanzmann's concerns throughout, notably with the process of coming to realise that total annihilation was being planned as it happened, the terrible ethical dilemmas that then confronted Jewish leaders in such a trapped situation, and the response of the outside world. For instance, Lanzmann might have included his interviews about Weissmandl with the equally absent Rejo Kastner and his rescue efforts in Hungary. The image of Weissmandl, constructed by the words of others, is that of a remarkable and charismatic figure who possesses in absentia the star filmic presence that Lanzmann sought throughout and that he got with Richard Glaser, for example. Although Weissmandl was not a camp inmate, he jumped from a train bound for Auschwitz in 1944, where his wife and 5 children who didn't escape with him were killed, making him a returnee from death of the kind that Lanzmann valued. Reports of Weissmandl's demeanour in the post-war era, where he was said to be insane with grief, mean that he was constantly reliving the past, another of Lanzmann's concerns. Lastly, since Weissmandl worked to stop the deportations from Slovakia and was the instigator of the more ambitious Europa plan to save all of Europe's remaining Jews by bribery, such an initiative would have been at the heart of any film about attempted rescue. Given that Lanzmann could not interview Weissmandl himself, he turned instead to the rabbi's closest associates. I'm going to mention 3 interviews of this kind from the outtakes, which make up at least 10 hours of footage. While Sigmund Forst knew Weissmandl before and after the war, Hermann Landau was Weissmandl's contact in wartime Switzerland and met him in person after 1945, and Andrei Steiner worked with him in wartime Bratislava, and Shmuel Tamir also met him, but I'm not actually going to talk about him here. In this way, Lanzmann might have experimented with a new kind of filmic testimony, one in which the central testifier is absent, but their words and presence are conjured up in a polyphonic way. As we will see, such an effort to construct the words of a missing person takes varied filmic form, using cinematography, embodiment, symbolic objects, dialogue, and the reading aloud of documents. The usual double focus on experience and distance that we always gain from video testimony is therefore enhanced further. Sigmund Forst, who knew Weissmandl before the war. Forst was an artist and a Hebrew calligrapher who came to New York from Vienna in 1939. He had met Weissmandl in 1931 by designing a book cover for one of the rabbi's publications. The interview opens with an unusual visual element, more often a trope from video testimony than art, which is what Lanzmann would consider his film, a close-up on the photograph of Weissmandl that Forst has on his desk. This is the man. This is the man we will talk about, yes. As we can see, there's a third but absent presence in the interview. Forst adds about Weissmandl's visit to him in New York before the war. He was here in this room as the rabbi's photograph, lit up by the reading lamp, is now. So the stage is set for what Lanzmann always seeks, that is, the retrieval of the past in the location where events took place. The director famously rejects archival imagery, but the photograph of Weissmandl is not of this kind. It's an object in the film's mise en scène, which attention is drawn to, and not a piece of documentary evidence. Forst claims that every aspect of life interested Weissmandl, although he was deeply steeped in Orthodox Judaism, coming from a small little town in Slovakia. So we learn of the attributes that became important during the war and which fascinated Lanzmann. Weissmandl was both of the world and not of it. He had an ability to captivate an audience and was always very persuasive. Forst recounts Weissmandl's description of getting the British Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, to support a pre-war rescue plan, although the Archbishop was not friendly to Jews, and Weissmandl was dressed so shabbily when he went to see him that he was not allowed into Lambeth Palace. In wartime Slovakia, this rabbinical shabbiness became a greater liability, as Andrzej Steiner, the third interviewee, describes the potentially dangerous nature of Weissmandl's appearance in his kaftan with hat and beard, meaning crucially for Lanzmann's purposes that others had to speak for Weissmandl to authority figures in the past, as they do in the present to us. Herman Landau. Herman Landau was a member of the Belgian Judenrat, but fled to Switzerland with his wife in 1942. In Switzerland, Landau was a contact for Weissmandl's pleas for money to support the Bratislava rescue plans, and after the war, he moved to Toronto. Clearly his story was also remarkable, but both he and Lanzmann are fully agreed that their real concern is rather with Weissmandl, whom Landau met for the first time in Switzerland in 1945. The interview opens with a kinetic reconstruction of the late rabbi's presence and his reaction to the lack of funds to bribe the Nazis. Of their first meeting, Landau says, Weissmandl was even so enraged that he hit me. He was hitting. He really hit me with his fist. I was running around the table. He was running after me until he catch up with me and hit me with his fist and say, "Why did you not do more? You could have done much more." You could see his fist is vibrating in the present. Landau now speaks as if he is Weissmandl. "Why did you not do more?" And his own hand intrudes into the frame, acting out the rabbi's assault. Jeffrey Hartman, and actually Gabe himself, have argued that the visible embodiment of survivors, their gestures and bearing, is part of the testimony. In this case, gesture testifies to the actions of an absent person. Later, the two men became so close that Landau says his wife demanded, "Are you married with Mr. Weissmandl or are you married with me?" Lanzmann continues to draw on this amazing statement to ask Landau to adopt Weissmandl's first-person subject position arising from this closeness by getting him to read out Weissmandl's letters and cables in the first person, but it's Weissmandl's first person. The letters include supplication and accusation. "We beg of you, with tears running from our eyes, you have but one obligation, to give money and money and money in large quantities. Cry to them about the souls of old people. There's a complex temporal and vocal layering here. Landau was the recipient of this letter during the war, so that the you is addressed to him. But in the present, he's speaking from the opposite position, I, as if he is Weissmandl. Landau concludes in the present, if I read this letter, I get myself tears in the eyes, because I remember that in this time we were mightless. The mingled tears of Weissmandl in the past and Landau in the present suggest not just a confluence of time, but of Landau himself with Weissmandl. He's an intermediary or even a medium for the late rabbi. I don't know if you can see, it's a bit dark, but the cinematography supports this effect when the camera silently films some documents over Landau's shoulder, so Landau is just anonymous now. We see Landau's finger trace the words, including Weissmandl's 3 initials in Hebrew. Landau is anonymous, but Weissmandl's name is legible. Like the photograph, the signature is a visible trace of the rabbi's one-time presence, now enacted by a stand-in. Andre Steiner. In the montage of voices about Weissmandl, Andre Steiner's is the closest to the late rabbi's wartime activities because he was on the spot with Weissmandl as a member of the Bratislava working group. Steiner had been an architect in Brno when it was occupied by the Nazis and fled to Bratislava. After joining the Slovakian partisans in the last months of the war, Steiner settled in Atlanta in the USA, and the interview takes place in his fabulous mid-century house which he built. Steiner differs from Forst and Landau in being a secular Jew. He says his beard is just for fun. Interestingly, Lanzmann asks about that, and I feel that the 3 bearded stand-ins are Weissmann surrogates. He reports that Weissmandl once said to him, in a very joking way, "Andre, just one thing is wrong with you, you are not Orthodox." But while the Orthodox Landau described his relationship with the late rabbi as almost marital, it's the assimilated Steiner who responds to Weissmandl's religious aura and his magic influence as a prophet, and we feel that magic influence as he's conjured up in the presence. Steiner moves from a physical description of Weissmandl to one that involves a spiritual kind of sight. He says that Weissmandl persuaded him, against his initial refusal, to demand a kosher kitchen for the Orthodox Jews in the Slovakian work camps. Steiner describes the effect of Weissmandl's beautiful blue eyes, the only beautiful aspect of the rabbi, and he says, "As I faced him eye to eye," obviously there's no one there to be faced eye to eye except Lanzmann, "suddenly I started to see not this outside, but through his eye, this incredible, beautiful human being." Continuing this tension between physical and spiritual attributes, what is visible and what isn't visible, in this interview all about someone who is not visible, Weissmandl advised Steiner to see the Slovak and Nazi authorities as only human. Steiner ventriloquizes Weissmandl, in this case talking about the Slovak official Isidor Kosso. Steiner says, "I'll tell you something," and he's quoting Weissmandl, so there's 2 voices here. "You go to Dr. Kosso, and the moment you start to speak to him, you look at him sitting on a toilet. And the very moment you look at him that way, he is the same human being that you are. Don't be ashamed, you will achieve it." And then Steiner speaks, and sure enough, he gained the kosher kitchens. For Steiner, the rabbi became more than his physical attributes, precisely by urging him to see the Slovak and Nazi authorities only as that. Weissmandl even urged Steiner to go to Dieter Vysliceny, the SS officer in charge of the Jewish question in Slovakia, to get him to stop the deportations, bribing him with dollars and the idea of a post-war alibi. Steiner recounts meeting the SS officer Vysliceny, and here it's as if we're hearing 3 voices. Steiner in the present repeats the words from the past which he spoke but which Weissmandl had told him to use. So the quotation marks from the transcript should really be double quotation marks. He quotes himself, quoting the rabbi. Does that make sense? Once, he says, once I was sitting with Visliceni, I told him everything Weissmandl had told me. You think you are going to win. We think you are going to lose. So be from now on our informer. In the present time of the interview, Steiner is once more Weissmandl's mouthpiece, this time presenting the rabbi's words to Lanzmann and by extension to us as viewers in Weissmandl's place. To conclude, Lanzmann's concept of an indirect testimony with a figure such as Rabbi Weissmandl was not supposed to be a conventional biopic or a talking heads documentary about a deceased person, nor is it a univocal testimony of the usual kind, where the voice issues from the body. But the director's focus on the topic of destruction for his released film Shoah meant that not only Weissmandl's absence, but the subject of rescue itself were too indirect to be included. The image of Weissmandl can therefore best be thought of as part of an uncompleted film about attempted rescue and resistance, not just in Bratislava, but also Budapest, Vilna and Minsk. It's one that Lanzmann never made, but which can be projected in the imagination of those who watch the outtakes. Thank you.